Hello, my name is Tony Schellinck. I am an amateur astronomer and a member of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada. This video describes to the beginner how to observe the moon. So, here's what we'll discuss. Why observe the moon? What is distinctive about the moon as an object to observe? How do we observe the moon? What can we see using binoculars or a telescope? And finally, sketching the moon's features when we observe the moon. So now let's imagine a rogue alien planet has entered the solar system. And fortunately for us, it has started to orbit the Earth. Well, you can imagine what would happen. Everyone would run out and buy a telescope and point it to this new alien planet. What would they see? They would see oceans. They would see mountain ranges. They would see valleys and all kinds of other interesting things. Well, it just so happens we do have another large body up there that might be called a planet, and that is the moon. Most people don't realize this, but the moon is actually larger than any of the dwarf planets that are in our solar system. The only reason it might not be called a planet is it happens to be orbiting the Earth, and therefore we call it a moon. But it's certainly an interesting thing to observe and learn about in its own right. So why should we observe the moon? Well, as I said, it's an alien world to explore from our backyard. It's also very bright, so you can observe it right downtown in the city or out in the suburbs, even under the street lights. So you can see a lot of detail as the shadow moves across the surface of the moon each night, and therefore what you see in detail changes. You can see amazing detail with just binoculars or a small telescope, so you don't have to invest a lot of money in equipment. And there's a lot to see on the moon, so it's an interesting place to visit. Now, observing the moon is different from observing planets or observing other deep sky objects. Why? Well, first of all, it's very small in the sky. I know you've all seen it many times, and sometimes when it's near the horizon it looks quite large, but it's actually quite small. Compared to the planets, however, it is very close. It is also very bright, and so it is easy to see with a small telescope. And also, it is easily observed about 2 weeks of each month. The moon has a 28-day cycle as the shadow line or terminator moves across the face of the moon, which means you can anticipate what you can see along the terminator when planning your observing session. So how do you view the moon? Well, most of you think of viewing the moon through a telescope, and that is fine. However, I would recommend that you start with binoculars. You can see a lot of features on the moon using binoculars. However, a typical binocular view is about 5 degrees wide in the sky, while the moon itself is only about half a degree wide. So you can see in this diagram, the moon will be quite small in your view. However, the human eye is an amazing thing, and it can see a lot of detail by focusing in the middle of the view here. What would we possibly see? Well, first of all, you have about a dozen oceans that are clearly defined. You can see here we have the Sea of Crisis, the Sea of Fertility, the Sea of Nectar, the Sea of Tranquility, the Sea of Serenity, the Sea of Vapors, the Sea of Cold, the Sea of Rains, the Sea of Clouds, the Bay of Rainbows, the Sea of Moisture, and the Ocean of Storms. So by viewing the moon with your binoculars, you'll get to know all of these seas. Now, viewing craters is different. That's because we tend to look for craters along the terminator. And the reason is the peaks are highlighted as bright, and the bottom of the craters are dark, which gives you a good idea of the shape and nature of these craters. So with a 4-day-old moon, we're going to be able to see these craters. And with a 7-day-old moon, other craters become visible, such as these ones. And again, these are visible using your binoculars. Other craters that are visible using your binoculars include these ones. So it's quite amazing when you look at it that all of these seas and all of these craters can be found and observed just using your binoculars. But if we want to get a close-up view of the moon, we really have to go to a telescope. You can easily observe the moon with relatively small aperture telescopes. That is, the size of the opening at the front of the telescope might only be a couple of inches wide. But we do want telescopes with a longer focal length. So you do not need big telescopes to view the moon. There are two basic types of telescopes. Those that use lenses to focus the light, called refractors, and those that use mirrors to focus the light or reflect the light. The latter telescopes include Newtonians and Schmidt-Cassegrain telescopes. Here we have typical Keplerian refractor telescopes that can be purchased at many department stores. The only drawback to these is sometimes you can see fringing on the moon. That is, blue on one side and red on the other, which somewhat obscures your view. However, that shouldn't stop you from having good views of the moon through these telescopes. Then we have reflector telescopes. The most common type is a Newtonian telescope. Here you have a large mirror at the back, and it reflects the light that comes down the tube up to a secondary mirror, which reflects it into the eyepiece at the front of the tube. Newtonian telescopes can be mounted on many different kinds of mounts. So here we have a German equatorial mount. The second one is called a Dobsonian mount, and this one is called an alt-azimuth mount. All of them work fine for viewing the moon. This little telescope down here is a little different in that it is a reflector as well. However, the light that enters the tube is reflected back to a stationary mirror that reflects the light back down the tube and out the back end. And this gives it a much longer focal length. And I'll discuss in a moment why that's advantageous. There's also what's called a short tube refractor. And it mostly does away with fringing, but I don't necessarily recommend it for use in observing the moon. Well, you can observe the moon with one of these. Because it has such a short focal length, it's difficult to achieve very high magnification. And as a consequence, you won't be able to see a lot of detail on the moon. So how do telescopes achieve different magnification? Well, first of all, the eyepieces that you use to look through a telescope come in many different sizes. The standard size eyepieces that are packed with telescopes are usually 25 or 20 millimeter eyepieces and a 10 millimeter eyepiece. So we will use these as our examples. The advantage of the 25 millimeter lens is that it has a lower magnification and therefore a wider field of view. Simply put, you see more of the sky with a lower magnification. This means if you're looking for something in the eyepiece, you should start with a low magnification eyepiece such as the 25 or 20 millimeter in order to more easily spot what you are looking for. If you decide you want a closer look at the object, then you center your target in the larger eyepiece and then insert the smaller one so that your target is still in the field of view. So the Keplerian telescope, a refractor, typically they may have 900 millimeter focal length. A reflector, such as this one, with the mirror in the front, has a light path that goes down to the back of the tube, up to the front of the tube, and then down to the back again. So even though it has a much shorter optical tube, the optical path inside of it is much longer. So this little telescope has a 1200 millimeter focal length. Now to determine magnification, we take our eyepiece, so in this case a 20 millimeter eyepiece, and we divide the size of that eyepiece into the focal length. So for the Keplerian, that's 20 into 900 will give you 45x, or a magnification of 45. For the reflector telescope, we divide 20 into 1200 and we get 60x. So you can see the advantage of a longer focal length. Now we take the second eyepiece, and it's only 10 millimeters, so we divide those into the focal length, and we get 900 divided by 10 gives us 90x, and 1200 divided by 10 gives us 120x. With this amount of magnification now, we will be able to see quite a bit of detail on the moon. The terminator is the area where the sun's illumination of the moon ends and the shadow begins. But it is not smooth, as you can see in these photographs. As the moon orbits the Earth, the terminator moves across the surface of the moon. The peaks of the crater edges are the first features to be sunlit and stand out against the dark background. The floor of the crater is still in deep shadow. However, the terminator actually moves quite quickly across the surface of the moon. So over the span of a couple of hours, you can observe the peaks of the crater rims as they come fully into view, and eventually the crater floor is illuminated. Once the crater is illuminated, however, it is difficult to see details of the crater, which is why astronomers like to view the moon's features that are on or near the terminator, so that the sun's rays are hitting at an oblique angle, and the bright areas and shadows highlight the crater's structure. As these features become visible along the terminator, interesting shapes may appear. One that is well known but appears every couple of months is the lunar X. In my photograph here, you might be able to make it out. Here, I'll help you. Now what this is are the rims of 3 craters that are very high and close together, so the sun illuminates them first. So it kind of forms an X, as you can see when you look closely, enough that it's worthwhile looking for and finding, and it's interesting. Rumor has it there's also a lunar Elvis, but I haven't been able to find that yet myself. Now this is me observing. Now my telescope's what you might call a medium telescope. It has it's an 8-inch Schmidt cast grain, but I have a 10 millimeter eyepiece in there, and I'm sketching the moon. Now what's interesting in this photograph is you can see that I'm right downtown. My telescope is set up at the end of my driveway. There are street lights everywhere, as you can tell by the shadows, and my neighbors have their lights on. It's about 7:30 on a March night, and I am happily sketching the moon. I was not the first to do this. Galileo in 1609 built a telescope, and one of the first things he did was point it at the moon. And of course, he didn't have cameras in those days, and he managed to sketch the moon. And this is what he came up with. You can see that he has the seas in approximately the right place. But when it comes to sketching the craters, well, he just drew in a bunch of craters. But this was a first. Up to this point, they thought the moon was just as smooth as a billiard ball. However, that was not the case. 70 years later, Cassini drew a second map. And this one, you can see a lot more detail in it. Well, he had better quality telescopes at that time. And you can see he drew in a lot of craters, and it was a lot more accurate when it came to sketching the seas. Now, I like to sketch, and so you saw me sketching there. Now, this sketch is not particularly pretty, but it has all the detail I need for purposes of observing. So what you can see are the areas that I'm going to leave bright white, You can see the gray areas and you can see where the dark areas are. You can see the size and the shape of the craters. And you can also see where Mare Crisium is, Sea of Crisis. I also record information about my observing time and equipment. So we recommend that you sketch because it greatly enhances your experience observing. You get to see these shapes, the sizes, the juxtaposition of features, and it helps you remember what the moon looks like. So this is really observing when you're doing sketching. When you're sketching, you should record information about your observing. This would include the date, location, the equipment, as well as the weather conditions that existed at the time. So in this case, it was March 28th from 7:50 to 8:15 in 2020 in Halifax. I had an 8-inch Schmidt-Cast telescope on a CG5 Celestron mount, and I had a 10mm eyepiece in there which gave me 200 magnification. It was a cloudless night. The transparency was perfect, but the seeing was only average. That is, how much the air was bouncing around. So the things I was looking at on the moon were kind of shaking a little bit, but that didn't stop me from being able to see a lot of detail. So you should record this in a book and keep that as your logbook. The more sketching that you do, the better you'll become at it. And you'll create memories. And not only that, you can share these memories, as other people will be very interested in looking at your sketches. And when you return to these objects in future years, these sketches will be your guideposts. Here are some more of my sketches. And what you can see here is that there's so many features on the moon that you can sketch. It can fill many, many nights of observing. And you'll have the satisfaction of knowing that you're becoming an expert on what is on the moon. Well, I hope you found this video to be informative and entertaining. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and may you have many clear nights for observing the moon.